What's going on, everybody? This is Jared Sandler welcoming you to another episode of the Just a Sec Conversation. I'm not sure if I've really ever heard of this guy. His name's Eric Nadel, maybe? Is it Eric? Oh, Eric Nadel. Okay, Eric Nadel. I think I've heard of him. No, in all honesty, as I'm sure you probably could tell by the awful attempt at sarcasm, I am very familiar with Eric. He is a teammate of mine and has been since 2015. He's been a mentor of mine, my foremost mentor since I was in high school. He is so very much influential and responsible for where I'm at in my career, and I'm so thankful for my relationship with Eric. He is a Hall of Famer for a reason. Vince Scully gets a lot of acclaim, and he deserves it. I tend to think that Eric doesn't get the acclaim that he deserves. He is one of the best broadcasters, not just in baseball, but in all of sports. And he's been doing it for 40-plus years, and he still has his fastball intact. Now, Eric's got so many other interests, and he's such an interesting individual. We didn't just talk baseball, and we're actually going to do a part 2 to this conversation that will release right around spring training 2021. So this is just the appetizer, but here we go. We've got Just a Sec with the Hall of Famer Eric Nadel. Before we get to it, just a reminder, would appreciate if you would subscribe, like, comment, or just share the link. Any and all of those would be appreciated. Without further ado, Just a Sec Conversation, episode 61, with the Hall of Famer Eric Nadel. All right, Eric, one of the questions I always like to ask people, when you think back to your childhood, what are the things that stand out to you? No particular direction for it, just what are the things that pop to your head?
Sports is the first thing that pops to my head. From the first time I was exposed to baseball and football and basketball, I was just crazy about them. Wanted to play it, wanted to watch it. When I finally got a chance to see hockey, it was the same sort of thing, although I couldn't play it. We didn't have any ice. But I started going to games immediately, and that really dominated my childhood. That and trying to get good grades. I mean, my parents instilled in us early that it was really important to get good grades. Even in elementary school, the report cards were a big, big deal. So those were the two things really that kind of dominated my life as a kid. Sports and, taking school seriously and trying to do well in school.
What was it about sports?
I'm not really sure. I just had a fascination with it. First time, I was given a ball to play with. Apparently, I really took to it. And then I was given a baseball glove at a very early age. And I remember playing catch with my dad and with my Uncle Norman really, really young. I don't know if I was 4 years old, something like that, when they first gave me a glove. It's one of my earliest childhood memories, maybe my earliest.
When did you start to grow an affinity for music?
That occurred really young. My parents would play music in the house. It was mostly Broadway shows. In those days, it was like Oklahoma and South Pacific and The King and I, shows like that. But my sister, who's 3 years older, started bringing home records, in the late 50s when I was probably 7 years old, 6, 7 years old. And she was bringing home stuff like Elvis Presley. And the first time I heard the Elvis Presley record that she brought home, it was Hound Dog on one side and Don't Be Cruel on the other side. We went nuts. And so we would buy every record he would put out. I think the next one was Jailhouse Rock and Heartbreak Hotel after that. And it was a really big deal. I also, because of the wanting to hear that music, I started listening to radio. And I was instantly hooked on radio, too. The disc jockeys in New York, Murray the K was the big rock and roll DJ then. And then Cousin Bruce Morrow came along, Cousin Brucey, and all the disc jockeys on his station, which was WABC New York. And I also became kind of a radio addict. So it was kind of natural to get into music more and more and more, listening to the top 20 on these radio stations and, getting excited each week about hearing the new records that would come on there and try and predict what would be number one this week and what the top 10 would look like. But all that happened, before I was even 10 years old.
Did you ever get into MTV when it really started to become a thing, or had you kind of grown past maybe the stage of who they were trying to target?
I was probably in their target. I was about 30, I think, when MTV started in the early 80s. But I just never got into music videos that much. I wanted to hear the music, but the music videos never really captured me the way they did most people. I love the fact, though, that I could turn on MTV and hear new music or hear new songs, by artists that I was familiar with. And, I was very excited about it. First time I had a chance to start watching MTV on a regular basis.
Okay. Now you talked about playing catch and whatnot. Did you ever, were you ever a part of a band? Did you play music, or did you just enjoy music from afar?
We actually had a jug band in high school. There was a band that we really liked back then called the Jim Kweskin Jug Band. And it was folk music, kind of bordered kind of on country, I guess you would say. And they used funny instruments. They used real guitars, but they also used, instead of a regular bass, they used a wash tub bass. And instead of drums, they used a washboard. They also had a guy playing the jug. And as kids in high school, we tried to duplicate them. And I had no musical talent at all, but I could bang on a washboard. So I was the washboard player in our high school jug band. And we mostly just played ourselves in our basements. And, we had this group of kids who would hang out together, maybe 20 kids who would hang out together on weekend nights. And, we would work up a song and play it. And we actually even played one gig senior year in high school at our senior class party. We actually played a few songs. That was our big performance. But that's the only time that I've ever really played, an instrument such as it was, a washboard. And the only time I ever really participated in a band. There were a couple of times I sang in shows, like high school shows and shows at summer camp. I didn't have a very good voice, but based on the part that I had in the show, sometimes I had to sing, which was usually quite embarrassing.
I guess maybe I know the answer to this, but so you have plenty of writing experience. You're a really good writer. Recently, you had the book of limericks, and I guess in the the last however many years, you've become more connected to the music world in that you can maybe reach people that have an influence. Did you ever consider writing songs, or did you ever write songs, or was that anything that ever crossed your mind?
Never really crossed my mind. I never really thought that I had any knowledge of, the actual music portion of it. I imagine if someone had come to me with a piece of music and said, write some lyrics, I would have considered doing it, but it never happened. And it might have been an interesting area to explore, but no, I never did it.
All right. You mentioned high school. Before we move on, I feel like I know so much about your life just from talking to you and certain things I'm going to ask you about here that I'd love for you to share that I've heard you share before, but I don't know that I've really ever heard you talk a ton about what you were like in high school. I know about, your journey into broadcasting, and I know even a little bit, when you were younger and learning that these guys got paid to watch sports, but what beyond the theater stuff you mentioned and being in a band, what were you like in high school, and what do you remember about that specific part of your life?
Well, I remember mostly the pressure to get good grades. I was in advanced placement classes and honors classes, and we were all trying to do the best we could to get into the best possible colleges. Our parents had, kind of drummed into our heads how important it was to do that. And we knew from our high school, maybe one or two kids would get into Harvard and Yale and Princeton and all those fancy schools. And we wanted to be the one to be accepted. And so we worked really hard. I'd spent far too much time on homework. And I would imagine that by a lot of people's viewpoints, I would have been in the nerd group in high school. But I was one of the cool nerds because, we also had dates and we also did other stuff. We went to concerts and, we went to parties and stuff like that. But the most important thing was making sure we got good grades. And then I continued to play sports. I played in an organized baseball league in high school, a sandlot league, and played on an organized basketball team one year in a league. Went to lots and lots of games. By the time I got to high school, I was allowed to take the subway and go to games without my parents. So we would go after school sometimes. We would rush home, get our homework done, so we could hop on the subway, at 5 or 5:30 and go into Manhattan and watch the Knicks play. They played every Tuesday night at the Garden, and the Rangers played every Wednesday night. And we would go, and with our student ID cards, we could get in for $1, sometimes 50 cents, and sit in the upper balcony at those games. And we would go to dozens of games a year. There were some days on the weekends, Sundays in particular, sometimes there would be an afternoon basketball game followed by an evening hockey game. We would go to both games. So a lot of the time that, the free time that I had in high school was spent going to games. And then when baseball started in the spring, we would do the same thing, although we couldn't really go on school nights to see a baseball game because the subway ride was too far and the games lasted longer. So we didn't get home in time to get the good night's sleep for the next day. So the baseball games were almost always on the weekends. But hockey and basketball games we would go to during the week quite a bit after school.
What was I'm just picturing young Eric out and about in the town. Do you recall, was there like something you did that was super mischievous that got you in a lot of trouble with your parents, or like something you could laugh at now, but back then was maybe not a laughing matter, or something that you perhaps even got away with that they didn't find out ever, or not until it was beyond the statute of punishment?
Well, I was a good boy. I did what I was supposed to do for the most part. I did really get in trouble one night. We went to a Mets game. It was a weekend night, but I was supposed to be home by, midnight or 11:30 or whatever time it was I was supposed to be home. And the Mets were playing the Giants with Willie Mays and Orlando Cepeda. They were the most exciting team to watch. And the game went extra innings. And we really should have left at the end of the ninth inning to get home by the time we needed to get home. And we didn't. And the game kept going on. And the game eventually went, I think, 16 innings. We left, I think, after the 12th. And we wound up, missing our curfew by an hour or something. And we got into trouble for that. I think we weren't allowed to go to a game for a month or something like that because we didn't leave when we were supposed to. But that's about the worst thing that I ever did.
One of the things that stands out, and I don't know if people behind the scenes or who aren't behind the scenes would identify this, but then if they gave any thought, they'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. The detail that you use in describing things to me is rooted in a few things, one of which is a curiosity and a willingness and commitment to follow through on that curiosity, whether it's asking great questions. And you obviously know this, but for people who don't, I go to Eric a lot. Hey, what's the best way to ask this question? I know the direction, but like how, and then it's just like a wordsmith. I mean, it's like a wizard, but then also just like the research that you do. I mean, anyone I guess could bury their head into a computer or a book and but like there always seems to be a direction with the research. And I guess the best word I can use for this is curiosity. Maybe that's not the best word, but like, where did that come from? Were you always like that? Was that something that you learned as you got older? Like that side of you, how would you attribute the evolution of that?
I really think it comes from my mother. My mother was an extremely curious person. She asked a million questions. And she always came up with stuff where you said, boy, that's really interesting. I don't know the answer. And it's a lot easier to look stuff up now, obviously. You just Google it and you get the answer in 10 seconds. Back then, I remember in the house we had two different encyclopedias in the house. We'd be running to encyclopedias trying to find the answer. We would, think about, she'd think of something. And, that's probably where it came from. And then my sister was a journalist. And I think I learned a lot about how to do that, how to ask questions and what sort of questions to ask just from watching her and seeing what she did. And I never had any sort of a journalistic background in high school or college. We didn't have any classes in journalism. So I just kind of had to feel my way into that part of the so-called reporting part of the job. But in terms of just general life and wanting to know things, that definitely was imparted by my mother.
When did you realize that was like a strength or a weapon that you could use to separate yourself?
I don't know really that it occurred to me until probably a few years into doing baseball, where I realized that, there are opportunities in a baseball broadcast to provide, interesting stuff because there's so much dead time that, what would be interesting? What do I want to know? What would be interesting for fans to know? And I think that's really the first time that, it occurred to me that, maybe I'm better at this than some other people in listening to other broadcasts and stuff and not hearing the kind of interesting stuff, that I was looking up and coming up with and, and wondering about and asking people about.
Eric, I think you've shared this before, and I referenced this earlier. You were listening to, I believe it was Mel Allen call a game, and you had this revelatory conversation with your dad, like, wait a second, and your dad was a dentist, like, you have to go and do this, but these guys get paid to broadcast baseball. Was that, in fact, kind of your first memory of, like, hey, this is something I'd really like to do?
Yeah, definitely. I was probably 7 or 8 years old, riding in the car with my dad. He was on his lunch hour, and he was going to drop me off and go back to work. And I asked him how the announcers got off work so they could go to Yankee Stadium. And, yeah, it was, whoa, well, that's what I want to do for a job. But, prior to that, I thought I wanted to own a deli. But it seemed like even more fun to be able to go to the ballpark and eat hot dogs and, talk about a baseball game. I already was really into radio, into the disc jockey aspect of it. And that was another thing that at that point I thought maybe someday I'll be like Cousin Brucey or Murray the K. I'll be a disc jockey. But when I realized that you could be on the radio watching a baseball game, you do both of those things and get paid for it. That seemed to be the perfect combination.
What do you remember about getting your first broadcasting job? And what was it?
Well, it was crazy. When I was a junior in high school, I went to a program at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, just north of Chicago, that was designed for high school students interested in radio. And they didn't have any sportscasting class as part of it, but it was a general broadcasting class, and they basically taught you to be a disc jockey and to run the board. And back then, you needed an FCC third-class license to do that. And they also gave us a course preparing us for the FCC third-class license exam and took us into Chicago at the end of the 6-week program and had us take the exam, and we all passed the exam. As a result of that, I was qualified to be a disc jockey, at least legally. And one of the kids in the program, a friend of mine, was from Hope, Arkansas. And he had gone to the program largely so he could get his license, because the following summer he was going to work at his local radio station in Hope, filling in for the 3 disc jockeys as they took their vacations. It was going to be a 6-week job. Each disc jockey would get 2 weeks off. And I got a call from him in April the following year. It was a big deal then to get a long-distance phone call. It cost a lot of money, and, mother answers the phone. Eric, it's your friend Crit from Hope, Arkansas. Hurry. And he said, hey, I wonder if you could do me a favor. And I said, what's that? And he said, would you be willing to come down here this summer and work at the radio station, filling in for the disc jockeys? And I said, well, isn't that what you're supposed to do? And he said, yeah, but I'm working at the A&P sacking groceries, and I'm making more than twice as much money as I would be making at the radio station. So if I can get somebody who's qualified to replace me at the radio station, I can keep this job at the A&P, and I really need the money. So I said, well, yeah. And I was from Brooklyn, and I was talking like this back then. I hadn't lost my accent yet. I said, they're not going to hire me. And he said, get a newspaper. He said, make a 5-minute recording of you reading the news. Do the best you can to tone down your accent. And at Northwestern, we had already started taking diction classes. We all had different regional accents. He sounded like he was from Arkansas. I sounded like I was from Brooklyn. And so I could tone it down a little bit. And he said, look, they're mostly just interested in somebody who can legally run the board, knows how to queue up records, and knows how to, read the meters and all the other things you had to legally do. They're not going to let you say very much on the air anyway. So I sent the tape down, and they said, you're fine, come on down. And that was my first job. I was on KXAR, AM 1340, the voice of Southwest Arkansas, and I had a 6-week job as a disc jockey. The first 2 weeks I worked, I think, from 6 to 10 in the morning, and then I had the 10 to 2 shift, and then I had the 2 to 6 shift. And that's how I spent my summer in 1968, which was the year I turned 17 years old, right before I went to college.
I'm curious, I remember what it was like for me around that age and like trying to put together a plan to get into sports broadcasting, and, you got to do this and you got to do that. So when you're in that 6-week shift as a DJ, I imagine you still had hopes of getting into sports. Like, what do you remember about how you were going to construct a plan to ultimately pursue the path that you really wanted to pursue, like in an athletic realm, and what was the first sports job?
Yeah, well, I was really lucky. When I was in high school, I sent letters to my favorite sportscasters in New York, asking them for advice on how to get into it. And the best piece of advice I got was from a guy named Bill Mazer, who was the first sports talk show host. This was before the original fan radio station in New York. He just had a sports talk show on WNBC in New York, and it was on every day, I think, from 4 to 7 in the afternoon. And I listened to it religiously every day, and I sent him a letter, and he wrote back to me, and he said, the most important thing you can do is go to a college that has a really good radio station where you can learn as much as you can about being a good radio announcer, and where you'll get a lot of time on the air. And he specifically said, so don't think you have to go to one of the schools that has a broadcasting program. And there weren't that many back then. Syracuse had one. I think Stanford had one. He said it's more important for you to get on the air, what we would call reps today. And you'll learn from the other students. Maybe there's a professor who oversees the station who will help. So do it that way. And when I started looking for colleges, and again, my focus was on going to the best college I could go to, I made sure that I focused on the colleges that had good radio stations. And so that was my idea. Go to a school where there aren't a lot of people like me who want to be a sportscaster, and I will probably get to broadcast all the sports. But he also said, do as much as you can in other areas of broadcasting on the air. Be a disc jockey, be a newscaster, go out and be a reporter. Anything you can do to be on the mic will help you. help you develop your style, make you more at ease on the mic. So the time that I spent in Hope, Arkansas as a disc jockey was a perfect example of that. I did get to introduce songs. I did get to do some commercials. I got to read newscasts. I got to read farm reports. So by the time I got to college the following year, I already had experience as a professional broadcaster. When I went up to the radio station, at Brown University where I went to college, I was, in fact, the only kid in my class who was interested in doing sports there. And since I had already been on the air and I had an audition tape I'd made, I went right on the air that year. I didn't have to go through the usual training program. And it was great because I started doing hockey games and football games, as the second guy or the third guy. And then as the upperclassmen graduated, I became the main play-by-play announcer on both of those sports. And hockey seemed to be the sport that I was best at, and hockey was a sport that was really expanding. The National Hockey League went from 6 teams to 12 teams, and a new major league was starting the year that I graduated, the World Hockey Association. There were minor league teams every place, and it seemed to be a great land of opportunity for me. So I made up an audition tape of highlights of Brown University games I had done, and I sent them out to every minor league hockey team in the country. And when I graduated at the end of May, I still didn't have a job. But a few weeks later, I got a call from the owner of the Muskegon Mohawks in Muskegon, Michigan. They were in the lowest possible rung of professional hockey. And his announcer had just quit, and he went into the file and, looked at the applicants and called me, and we had a 1-hour phone conversation, and the next day he called me back and offered me the job.
And was this Moose Lawler?
Well, it wasn't Moose Lalo. It was Moose Lalo's boss, a guy named Jerry DeLeese, who owned the team. But he was in the process of selling the team to a local group headed by Moose Lalo, who was the coach of the team and had been a star player for the team for many years. So as part of that whole thing, Moose Lalo became the general manager and ultimately became my boss within a few months after I arrived there in early July of 1972.
Okay, and then to stick on the hockey path, so then was it that team that ultimately left, or how did you end up moving south to continue doing hockey?
Well, I worked there for 3 years, and I enjoyed the job, but I didn't like living there that much. It was really cold. It snowed every day during the winter. I was married at the time, and my wife didn't really like it. And I kept applying for jobs in bigger markets. And, I was actually even thinking that if I couldn't get a job in a better market, after 3 years, I probably wasn't very good at this, and I should think about doing something else. And I took the LSAT, and I started applying to law schools. And then one day I saw a note in the Hockey News, which was the trade publication, saying that John Brooks, the announcer for the Oklahoma City Blazers, which was the AAA team for the Toronto Maple Leafs, was quitting because he had been hired by the Oklahoma Sooners as the voice of their football and basketball teams. So I got on the phone and I called the Oklahoma City Blazers, and the general manager, who was also the coach, a guy named Ray Miron, said, "Yeah, the job's wide open. We just found out about this last week. Send me your stuff." And he called me back, maybe a month later, and he said, "You're one of the 2 finalists for the job. I want you to fly to Montreal, where we have our annual meetings at the beginning of June, and I'll interview both you and the other finalists." As it turned out, it was just one other finalist, and I'll hire one of you, and that'll be it. And that's how I moved from Muskegon to Oklahoma City.
And that other finalist?
That other finalist was Mike Emrich. And somehow I got the job over Mike Emrich, and I'm convinced to this day it's because the way Ray Miron conducted the interviews was he took each of us out to dinner, me on the first night and Mike on the second night, and Ray drank a lot. and I stayed with him drink for drink, and we had a really good time. And Mike Emrick, I know, hardly drinks at all. And I have a feeling that I got hired because I would be a better wingman on the road for Ray Miron than Mike Emrick would have been.
Oh, man. And I want to get more into the base, like your entry into baseball, because Doc Emrick, I know, is not the only big name over whom you've gotten a job, and this other big. I guess you know what? I'm not going to tease this. Eric and I are going to do a part 2 closer to spring training 2021, but I can't just throw this out there. So you and I have something in common. I don't know that I've ever told you this, but we have both beaten out Minnesota Twins legends for broadcasting jobs. I'll tell you mine, and then I'd love for you to share yours. When I got my job in Great Falls, Montana, with the Great Falls Voyagers, Jack Morris was, I didn't know this. They didn't tell me until I think it was like almost, the year was almost over. I had no idea, I assumed other people were interested in the job. I knew nothing about anything other than ultimately that I got the job. Jack Morris, who I think to boost his Hall of Fame profile, wanted to really, get into broadcasting. And someone had told him, we'll let you do it, but you need to spend a year broadcasting in the minors. And I guess Jack has a house or had or whatever in Montana. And of the Montana teams, Great Falls was the one that had an opening. And they basically, apparently he wanted to do it, but they basically told me that they didn't believe he would actually go through an entire summer staying in the bad hotels, riding on the bus. And so they didn't want to be in a position to have him quit in the middle of the year. And so they chose to then open up the hiring to a bunch of broadcasting dorks like myself. Okay. And I got the job. But I guess in a weird, twisted way, I beat out Jack Morris. Now, your story's better, and yours involves someone of greater baseball significance. But could you tell the story of the time you beat out a Minnesota Twins legend?
Yeah, the way that the job opened up that I ultimately got hired to do at the end of the 1978 season was the Rangers broadcasting rights in the first 10 years the team was in Arlington were owned by the city of Arlington. It's one of the ways they got Bob Short, the owner of the Washington Senators, to move the team to Texas, is they bought the broadcast rights from him for 10 years and paid him in advance so he could pay off all his debts and leave Washington, D.C. Without owing any money. And as a result, the city of Arlington put together a broadcast network, and they made a deal with KXAS to be the flagship station on TV, and a deal originally with KRLD and then with WBAP a couple of years later to be the flagship station on the radio. And they were still in that deal in 1978 when I got a phone call from Roy Parks, who was the director of the Rangers broadcast network for the city of Arlington, saying that he was looking for another announcer. And I said, well, why are you looking for another announcer? And I used to watch and listen to all the games. And they had John Miller, who went on to do Sunday Night Baseball for 20 years and now is the voice of the San Francisco Giants, and a local guy named Bill Merrill. They were the radio announcers. And on TV, they only did 27 games then on TV. And Frank Gleber was the TV announcer. He was the sports anchor of Channel 5, as well as being a national announcer who did a lot of golf tournaments and NCAA events and stuff like that. But the color man who they would use on those 27 games was a guy named Ken Suarez. And he had been a catcher for the Rangers. And when he retired, the owner of the Rangers, Brad Corbett, gave him a job as a salesman for his plastic pipe company. That's how Brad made his money. He had a PVC pipe company called Robintech. And Ken Suarez would get time off from his job with Robintech to do these 27 games on TV. And Brad Corbett was the guy who really liked to hobnob with the players. And one day, apparently he was out golfing with Harmon Killebrew. I don't know how he wound up with Harmon, but he was at some Pro-Am tournament playing golf with Harmon Killebrew, the former Minnesota Twins great. And Harmon had done a little bit of broadcasting in the Minnesota area. And Brad said, we should hire you to be our TV announcer. That would be great. We'd have a Hall of Fame baseball guy as our TV announcer. And Harmon said, I'd love to do it. So Brad called up Roy Parks, the director of the network, and said, I want you to hire Harmon Killebrew to be the TV announcer next year in 1979. And Roy said, well, I can't do that. My contract with Channel 5, KXAS, requires me to use their sportscaster as the play-by-play guy on these telecasts, which are on Channel 5. And so Brad said, well, fire him. Use Harmon Killebrew anyway. And Roy said, no, I can't do it. And Brad said, well, if you won't do that, I won't let you use Ken Suarez as the color man on those telecasts. And Roy said, okay, I'll find somebody else. Well, I turned out to be the somebody else. And Roy was looking for not just somebody to do the color on the 27 telecasts, because Bill Merrill, who was the number 2 radio announcer, was planning to retire in a year or two. And he wanted to start grooming somebody to replace Bill Merrill. And that's how he wound up talking to me about the job, because he had heard me do hockey. He liked the way I did hockey. And as it turned out, he was also looking for somebody to help him sell advertising and put the network together. I had done all those things, in my minor league hockey jobs. I was working then for the Dallas Blackhawks, doing all that stuff. And, I told him if he hired me to do the 27 games, then I would also do the sales job for him. And that kind of clinched it for me. But the reason the job opened up at all is because Brad Corbett promised the job to Harmon Killebrew and then couldn't deliver. And so he denied the city of Arlington the right to use Ken Suarez.
And that's how you beat out Harmon Killebrew. He only has a few more home runs, but he doesn't have the broadcasting career.
And he wound up doing Twins games, for a while. He was actually really good, and I got a chance to meet him and spend time with him. And wonderful, wonderful guy, super kind to me. But if it weren't for him, I probably would never have gotten this job.
Did you ever tell that story to him?
Yeah, I did. He was quite amused, and he didn't necessarily take Brad Corbett seriously. That Brad was going to actually hire him, and the rumors were that Brad had offered broadcast jobs to several players. Nelson Bryles, who had played for the Rangers, Sparky Lyle, when he played for the Rangers, Jim Sundberg. Jim Sundberg actually became a Rangers broadcaster, but he was one of at least 4 people who we know were promised broadcast jobs by Brad Corbett when he didn't even own the broadcast rights. He didn't even have the right to hire a broadcaster.
Well, there you go. Episode 61 of the Just a Sec conversation with the Hall of Famer, the legend, the voice of summer for Rangers baseball, the great Eric Nadel. Someone I'm very proud to call a friend and a mentor. Hopefully you enjoyed some of what he had to share. Again, more coming in a few months as we gear up for spring training 2021. We'll have part 2 of this conversation. Thanks again for tuning in. Like, comment, subscribe, share. Would appreciate all of it. Until next time, stay safe, be healthy, and we'll talk to you soon.